This is Third Paradigm, and I'm Teresa Coraggio. I've been saying lately that I believe we're living in the desperate end times of empire, that the empire is dismantling itself, and it's not too soon to start planning in very pragmatic ways for the system that we want to replace it. This would be something that would be particular to the place that we live and the community in which we are, that would take advantage of the assets, but also deal specifically with the problems. That is what I explain at the ending of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. But in order to get there, I first have to disabuse you of the notion that we can fix it by tweaking the current system. Towards that end, I talked about the first chapter in my book in Debunking Democracy on Shoshana Zuboff. And that showed that democracy from its Greek origins has always been based on empire, has always been based on slave owning. Now I want to talk about the second chapter, which is called Making a Market for Plunder. And these are both in the section called Pieces of Slave, in which I talk about money as being trade in pieces of slave, where we don't buy slaves by the whole body anymore. We just rent them by the hour. So that's going to look at some of the myths of money's origin, going through David Graeber and his anthropology, his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and look at things like the idea that coinage made barter better, or that religion was the antidote to greed. I'll look at the military coinage slavery complex and how the barbarians, the concept of the barbarians, changed things and what the law codes were around that. So let's look at coinage and get started. I start with this chapter with two quotes. The first is from Gil Baile. There have been periods of history in which episodes of terrible violence occurred, but for which the word violence was never used. Violence is shrouded in justifying myths that lend it moral legitimacy, and these myths, for the most part, kept people from recognizing the violence for what it was. And the second is from David Graeber. If nothing else, it is surely significant that all the Axial Age religions emphasize the importance of charity, a concept that had barely existed before. Pure greed and pure generosity are complementary concepts. Neither could really be imagined without the other. Both could only arise in institutional contexts that insisted on such pure and single-minded behavior, and both seem to have appeared together wherever impersonal, physical, cash money also appeared on the scene. I begin by asking, what is money? I define money as a means of organizing labor in the interest of whoever creates it. So while politics and government decide what they want to do, it's economics and money that determine how. So we think of taxation as being that way that creates redistribution, that money itself creates trade, creates a system of reciprocity, but then taxation creates the charity that helps those who can't contribute in that way. Is this actually true? Let's examine it. In Economics 101, we've been taught that money replaced barter, that what barter required was this double coincidence of wants. I have something that you want, and you have something that I want. And that's very inconvenient because I can be wandering around with this knife that I made, but do you have a fish that you're trying to get rid of that I need before it starts to stink? So that was something that coinage, according to that myth, replaced. However, David Graeber says no, that in the beginning was the gift, that the community ran on a gift economy in which not only was there exchange, but it happened in a way that enabled people to save face. So that if I were to give you something, I'd never make sure that it was exactly what I was going to get back. I'd make sure it was a little bit more, a little bit less. I'd want to keep that exchange going because that keeps the circle and it makes it so that everyone is not seeing it as a trade, which would be insulting. So he says that the only time barter was used was when you had someone from outside of the community that you weren't going to see again. The word bargain comes from a barter gain, and that's what you do with the near enemy. You would try to get some kind of deal so that you had bragging rights for how you had bamboozled them. But with someone from your own community, you would never do that. And if a person is in need, then that's even more of a reason to give it as a gift. That the Inuits, he quotes as saying, up here we say that by gifts one makes slaves and by whips one makes dogs. Of course we share because we're human. Graeber has the memorably titled chapter called Games with Sex and Death, and in it he writes, the economist's insistence that economic life begins with barter, the innocent exchange of arrows for teepee frames, with no one in a position to rape, humiliate, or torture anyone else, is touchingly utopian. Graeber points out that the earliest coins were struck in 547 BCE, before Common Era, and that happened in Anatolia, which was modern-day Turkey, and then spread to Greece and then to the Persian Empire. At the same time, during that axial age of 500 before Common Era to 500 into the Common Era, was the rise of all of the world's greatest religions. So Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, Christianity, and Islam. He sees these as related. This was also just after the invention of Greek democracy. And as I talked about in Debunking Democracy, what that did was create a pyramid in which if you added to the military by using your wealth as a feudal lord, you could move your way up in the assembly and become part of that Areopolis. But at the same time, it created primogeniture, which meant that only the oldest son could inherit the land, which meant that the other sons needed to find some way to support themselves. And they did this becoming a trained army. So the Greek mercenary warrior was the most sought after. Every feudal lord who wanted to conquer their neighbors wanted to get these Greek mercenary soldiers. But the rub was they didn't want to then take the spoils of conquest and have to divvy it up so that they could take it back to Greece and be paid for their labor. So here was the genius of it. What they did was take the spoils and the gold and the metals from the previous conquest, and they marked it with a value that was higher than the value of the metal itself. And they would pay the soldiers in this, but then they would tax the people who were previously conquered. That meant that they had to supply the soldiers with food, shelter, armor, sex, whatever it was that they could use to get those coins. And that enabled them to not be behind on their taxes and then fall into slavery themselves. So they equipped and made the warrior into a self-perpetuating machine. It could go out and conquer new territories, bring in new spoils, be able to hire new soldiers, and have the people themselves who had already been conquered be able to then participate in the conquest of their neighbors. Coinage became the fuel for a vast extraction machine. The king was able to engage in conquest without having to feed or equip his army, but that was the least of his benefits. He also had a military machine that could enforce his every decree. And so violence could put down rebellions, but most people didn't rebel. In a sense, they became shareholders in the conquest. They were part of divvying up the spoils of war. And coinage was then encouraged in every transaction. That trickled down so that then they might be able to make out like bandits. The same kind of extraction went on within the community that had gone on with their neighbors. What taxation did was create a debt without ever entering into a contract or getting any benefit. So those who were unable to pay their taxes ended up needing to sell their wife, their children into bonded labor, and then to sell themselves into slavery. Those who rebelled were sent to the worst form of slavery, which was in the mines. So it created a system where those who had much were served by those who had some, served by those who had little, and those who had none were only good for more extraction from the earth to create more coins. Within this system, even a free man who had a little bit of land wasn't free to be a subsistence farmer. He needed to get coins. And so somehow he needed to tie in and collaborate in the material provisions for the army. No matter what he did, even if it was a dozen steps removed, he was supporting someone who was then supporting the soldiers. Everyone essentially worked for the king. And the difference between an entrepreneur or a tax collector who got fine profits from this and the impoverished peon was only a difference in style, not in substance. Taxation made life itself into a commodity, and in effect, what the coins did was pay your own slave price for you and your family, pay your own ransom so that you could buy your freedom for another year. A treatise from India in the 3rd century before the Common Era says, "The treasury is based upon mining, the army upon the treasury. He who has army and treasury may conquer the whole wide earth." The army that taxation supported could also be used against the people in a revolt. Graeber explains that Greek cities tended to adopt legislation limiting or abolishing debt peonage altogether, and then to forestall future crises, they would turn to a policy of expansion, shipping off the children of the poor to found military colonies overseas. Before long, the entire coast from Crimea to Marseille was dotted with Greek cities, which served in turn as conduits for a lively trade in slaves. Something we should pay attention to today, as the petrodollar loses value, is that the money itself was not backed by the labor of the citizens. If the empire had disappeared in a flash, the occupied countries wouldn't be any worse off. But if those occupied countries disappeared, the value of the coins would tank immediately after, because what they were taking the vanquished occupied countries and breaking them into small little increments that could be traded. They were trading in pieces of slave. So that's something that we need to be looking at. What is the value of our money and what really backs it? At the same time that you had coinage creating this materialism that said that people were by their nature greedy and selfish, you had these religions sprouting up with this ideal of the completely selfless person. So those were interdependent on each other, and Graeber writes about it this way. The ultimate effect was a kind of ideal division of spheres of human activity that endures to this day. On the one hand, the market, on the other, religion. To put the matter crudely, if one relegates a certain social space, simply to the selfish acquisition of material things, it is almost inevitable that soon someone else will come to set aside another domain in which to preach that, from the perspective of ultimate values, material things are unimportant, that selfishness, even the self, are illusory, and that to give is to better than receive. Graeber phrases the central question of his book as, how is it that moral obligations between people come to be thought of as debts, and as a result end up justifying behavior that would otherwise seem utterly immoral? David contrasts a human economy, which he sees as community-sized, in which a person is surrounded by a nexus of relationships in which they are irreplaceable, and a commercial economy in which a person is a unit of exchange, something that can be used to pay off a debt. And to do that, you first have to rip a person from their context. Greek democracy was the veneer of a human economy that was over the reality of a commercial economy. So while it was against the law to subject another Greek in debt peonage, it was a vast network of barbarians that supported that. The barbarian law codes give one example, which is compensation in the Welsh laws is reckoned primarily in cattle, and in the Irish ones in cattle or bondsmaids, cummal, with considerable use of precious metals in both. In the Germanic codes, it is mainly in precious metal. I write, it's telling that silver and gold are mixed with cattle and chattel, because those who had none of the former became the latter. When the Roman Empire fell, the barbarian countries could have restored their tribal sovereignty and formed an alliance of mutual protection and trade. Instead, the barbarians of France, Spain, Portugal, and England aspired to be like Rome and Greece, the next great empire. Indians, Africans, Americans, and the Celt would be among their next victims. At the end of each chapter, I outline what the paradigm shifts were that I talked about in that chapter. And then I give definitions so that when we're having discussions, we are each looking at the same definition for the same word or phrase. And I end with questions like primogeniture. Even though it kept it for the oldest, was it better or worse than our modern system in which each generation has to buy their property and home all over again? And looking at fair trade laws, and if the currency reflected that, would it change the problems of immigration? Would we even need borders? And I end with the question of whether it's possible to go directly from being a slave-owning economy to a gift economy, or do you need to have some kind of system of reciprocity and self-reliance in between? If you enjoyed this, here's the one on the first chapter called Debunking Democracy, and here is a playlist on global economics that will bring you up to the present day. And thank you to all of my subscribers, and I am so enjoying my Substack subscribers also. So look it up there to get more text and links to the book and all of the community that that's bringing in. Thank you.